Alrighty, I think we are go. And good evening and welcome. It is 1 minute after 7 o'clock here on the lovely west coast of whatever the hell country I'm in. United States of America. That's it. It took me a moment. And hello to everybody who's showed up already. Let's see who's here. Hello, Jared. Hello, Greg. Hello, Jerry. Hello, Jim. Hello, Becca. Hello, Emily. Hello, Jeremy. Yes, the fingers, they do wiggle. They do all kinds of clever tricks. Hello, Kelly. Happy Thanksgiving from Canada. Oh my God, I forgot it was Canada's Thanksgiving Day. Well, happy Thanksgiving back to Canada. And may you all have much to be thankful for. I have a deep, fond spot in my heart for Canada. I sort of was for a while kind of a semi or honorary Canadian because I lived with a Canadian family, not in Canada, but in Palo Alto, where I grew up. And they were from Saskatchewan, specifically they're from Saskatoon. And I had a lovely time. They were lovely people. They treated me very, very well, and I will always think highly of them. It was always funny, though, because, of course, they were living in California, where I live. And come about October of the year, they were basically going to ground for the winter, at that point. It was very much like, yeah, it's October, gotta play cards. And I would say, guys, it's like 70 degrees outside and nice. No, October, gotta play cards. Because they basically, I guess in Saskatchewan, you don't go out much in the wintertime. Me being a mild weather guy, I don't know much about that. But and they also had like a plug attached to their car, with like a 30, 40-foot extension cord on it, just coming out from underneath their engine. And I remember the first time I saw it going, you couldn't drive very far if that's an electric car before you hit the end of your plug. And they pointed out to me, as all of you cold weather people already knew, that it's an engine block warmer. So, what did I know? What did I know? I was 18, had never at that point been to any any cold places. So then I later spent part of a winter in Madison, Wisconsin, and that just about killed me. So I don't think I ever will probably spend much time in really, really cold weather. I'm not good at it. Who else has showed up? Nicholas, hello. Danny, hello. K.L. Anderson Gonzalez, hello. How are you? Good to see you all. I'm just about to start reading again. As I mentioned to the virtual crowd last night, we are basically all still fine here in terms of COVID and being symptom free and all that stuff, and still kind of locked down and generally staying out of trouble as much as possible. We do have some health issues in among family and friends, some fairly severe ones, so we're obviously concerned about that. My dad's going in for an operation tomorrow, which is a fairly serious one, and so, of course, I've been fretting about him a lot, and hoping all the best for him, needless to say, because he's my dad, and he's a great guy. This is the person that the Otherland books were all dedicated to, and those of you who have met me at readings or whatever may have heard the questions about Dad and the dedications in the Otherland books. I won't tell it tonight because it is a longish, but I think somewhat entertaining story. But anyway, so that's my dad, and any good thoughts you could throw in his direction would be most welcome. So what else is going on? Just the usual. I'm just working on several different books all at the same time, and have spent the last, honest to God, 3 days trying to think through a simple time paradox, except as you might guess, there is no such thing as a simple time paradox. But it's something that I'm working on for the last, or at least the third book of the Dragons of Ordinary Farm, our young adult or all ages books, which we're finally getting around to the third part of. Deborah already did the first draft and handed it to me months ago, but I was very deeply involved with Navigator's Children and Brothers of the Wind, and so now that I'm in a little bit of a hiatus on those other two for various reasons, I'm working on the third Ordinary Farm book, which is called The Heirs, with an H. The Heirs of Ordinary Farm. And I'm only telling you this because I literally have spent 3 days doing nothing but parsing out time paradoxes. Because for those of you who know the Ordinary Farm books, there is a time travel element in them. I won't go into any more detail because I would want people to read them. Even though they're technically young adult books, I think anybody can read them and enjoy them. There's some very cool things in them. But in this last volume, a lot of things that have been alluded to or mentioned have to be solved. And that requires a huge amount of figuring out, okay, if you change time, how is that going to work? And how, what order do these things happen in? And why did these things appear to be one way and now they're another way? And when was time actually changed? And it gets unbelievably complicated. And of course, being a time paradox, there's always the time paradox issue of, well, if something didn't work out, why not just go back before that happened and fix it then? And if that doesn't work, go back before that, and et cetera, et cetera. So you have to come up with not only solutions for the time paradox, but you have to come up with solutions to why people haven't gone back and fixed the time paradox or the thing that went wrong or whatever it is, So it's amazingly complicated once you start really thinking about it. And the curse of being the kind of writer that I am, and to an extent what Deb is, since she wrote the first draft, is that even writing the fantastical, we sort of want it all to make sense. We want things to make sense that they could happen in the real world, even though they're fantastical things. So that's what I've been working on. I literally 3 days straight, just like lying around, sitting around, plugged into my earbuds to mask out the noise of the household animals and young people, and just thinking and discarding and thinking and discarding and trying this and trying that and throwing that out. So I'm tired, but that's not a complaint. That's just an explanation why if I stumble over a few words here and there tonight, that's why. That's because I've spent 3 days messing around with wibbly wobbly, timey wimey stuff, as the good doctor put it, as several of the good doctors put it. Anyway, for those of you who don't know, it's Doctor Who that I'm referring to, from which series came the wonderful phrase wibbly wobbly, timey wimey, as a description of what time truly is. Anyway, last night I lost my video feed partway through. I think I may have a virus or something on the computer. Fortunately, it didn't seem to affect everything else. But if I stop and ask you, can you still hear me? Or something like that, that's why. And all I'm asking is just for one person to just say, yeah, can still hear you. Because I completely lost my end of the feed, so I had no picture anymore. I didn't notice that I was still on the other end. I didn't know for certain that I was still on the other end of communication. Anyway, so anything else that needs to be discussed? I don't think so. I'm just in that mode, and I feel like there are important things that need to be said, but in fact, the only important things that need to be said are hello. Good to have you here, and I'm going to read some more. So, I am reading from The Heart of What Was Lost. Last night we had got through to the Hikedaya, or Norns as they're known, had retreated. Oh, by the way, thank you all for the good thoughts for my dad that people have been posting. I appreciate that. And at some point I'll pass that along to him after he's out of surgery. So thank you. So, the Hikedaya, or Norns, remember this takes place after the end of To Green Angel Tower, and the Norns have lost the Storm King's war, and lost the Storm King, for that matter, and they are retreating. And they have retreated by this point all the way to Nakiga, their mountain city. And they are inside, and the mortals, led by Dukas Grimner and others, are besieging it from the outside. And the mortals have rebuilt their iron ram with the bear's head, and they are trying to knock down the great gates of Nakiga. Meanwhile, inside the city, of course, the remaining Norns, including our two protagonists, I guess, focal point characters, Vieki and his master Yarike, who was the High Magister of the Builders Order, have been involved in the planning. where, among other things, General Sunoku has proposed they need to arm their slaves, and in the long run, that the Norns, who have become, the nobles have become very few, are going to have to start breeding with their slaves as well, because the mortals are have far overtaken them in terms of population. Then Yarike has also told Vieki, who is his next in line, and whom he had said when he was showing him the family heirloom of the Heart of What Was Lost, a gem on a chain. But at that point, he had also told Vieki that he was going to make him his successor someday as the High Magister of the Order of Builders. But since they've been back in Nakiga, Vieki has discovered that Yarike not only won't talk to him, doesn't want to talk to him, but is kind of telling him, stay away from me. And oh, by the way, your wife blabbed this whole thing. So just, that's bad news. We don't want that happening, as far as your possible elevation. So stay away from me for now. So Vieki is very upset about that. Meanwhile, among the mortals who are besieging them, led by Dukas Grimner, Porto and Endry, the two southern soldiers. Endry was wounded at the last battle and sadly has just died, leaving Porto alone and feeling a great deal of loss and responsibility that his young friend, he was not able to save him. So that's what's going on. And I am now starting a new section. Porto's days merged into what seemed an endless succession of climbing and huddling out of the wind, interspersed with moments of sheer terror. He did his best not to think about his home and his wife and child, because what good would that do? He was stuck here at the end of the world in the most foreign of foreign lands, and he had no more control over whether he would ever return to Perdruin than he did over the stars wheeling through the night sky. He had plenty of time to watch those stars because, despite exhaustion, most nights he could not easily fall asleep, haunted by ghosts old and new. And since a few of their tunnels still lay undiscovered, the mountainside belonged to the Norns after dark. Any mortal rash enough to tread in their domain or even make himself unnecessarily visible would usually be found dead in the morning with a single black arrow lodged in a vital spot. But during the daytime, the mortals' greater numbers gave the mountain goats, as Porto's troop dubbed itself, an advantage that they pressed as hard as they could, overwhelming the small groups of Norn bowmen they encountered on the mountain's rocky sides, although seldom without a pitched and often deadly struggle. The fairies seemed to have run out of magical tricks, but that only meant they fought more fiercely. One of the white foxes, already disarmed and all but dismembered, had still managed to drag a comrade of Porto's to the ground and sink teeth into the man's neck before any of the others could help him. Porto and the others had pulled the Norn off him and stabbed the pale creature until it stopped moving, but the man it had attacked bled to death. Porto could not have hated the white foxes more. Their unnatural quickness, their near-identical faces, their utter refusal to surrender. But he also recognized their bravery. Outnumbered and driven to ground like badly wounded animals, they fought to the last breath for their land. He hated these things that had killed Endry, and Brinder's son Floki, and so many others, but he also had to respect their courage. Would I do the same if it were my home and my wife in danger, my sweet Sida, or little Tinio? He believed he would. He prayed that he would, but only God knew with certainty what a man would do when such a time came. Hours became days, each day with its mountainside patrol, and virtually every patrol with its ration of sudden danger and death. Days became senites, and the grave trenches the Northmen had dug were filled and covered over, and more trenches started. But still, the Nakiga gates held. Still, the mountain would not yield. The air, always cold, began to turn colder. The sleet that blew into their faces as the mountain goats clambered over the treacherous high slopes felt as hard and sharp as daggers. Summer was waning, and autumn was coming down across the north. The winter, The true, deadly winter that even the hardiest rimmersmen feared was on the way, and Porto and his fellows were trapped in its path, like beetles exposed in a shattered log. Troop Governor Ruhoa looked up from his position of supplication as though ready for execution. He held up his hands in the gesture commonly called release to the parent, something taught to children that apparently still remained even after all the training the builder's order gave its officers. They will not go farther, host foreman, the governor said without meeting Viecki's eye. The shame is on me and my house. I should execute them all, but I cannot. Viecki generally did not believe in executing balky workers, especially at a time when trained builders were in short supply, but he was tempted to make an exception now, starting with the troop governor himself. Do they not understand their people's need? Viecki added an appropriate edge of contempt to his words. We are preparing a place for our folk to shelter if the gates fall. If there is no water close to that shelter, not even the order of song can save us. They cannot sing it up out of pure stone. Our people will all die, gasping from thirst, like the proud walking fish in the ancient stories. Like animals. Even the queen herself. He narrowed his eyes. I should have these shirkers dig a pit and cast themselves in. You too, though live burial is better than you deserve. The governor fell forward, sprawled on his face at Viecki's feet, and moaned. Take the head from my shoulders, host foreman, he begged. I have failed you, the garden, and the mother of all. And what good would your head do me? Viecki fought to keep his peevishness in check. It is too ugly to make much of a trophy. Get up and tell me why your charges are willing to die instead of obeying orders that come not just from me, but from High Magister Yarike himself. Ruho backed slowly into a crouching position. The workers are frightened, Lord Viecki. Nobody but the Order of Song ever goes into those depths by choice, and only the singers ever come back out again. The workers say they cannot help themselves. They take a few steps into the downward tunnels and their hearts squeeze like a fist in their chests until they almost swoon. Something is down there. Of course something is down there. Many things are down there. The mountain is ours, though, and nothing down there is to be feared. We have Lord Akinabe's word. All the same, there are still 4 of our engineers missing, Lord. The ones you sent first into the lower tunnels. They did not return. But some of the men say they heard those engineers' voices, pleading for someone. The foreman hesitated. Pleading for someone to come and wake them. That is what I have heard. But you did not hear this yourself. Viecki scowled. Perhaps a few executions would be necessary after all. No, but one of them, old Sasigi, appeared to me in a dream. I swear it is true. He said that they were all lost in the darkness, a darkness that breathed, and that he feared if he did not find his way out again, it would find him and chew him and swallow him down, and he would never awaken again. Superstition, said Viecki, but that did not keep superstitious fear from tickling the nape of his own neck. A dream only. I expect more of you than to spread this kind of thing, Governor Ruho. He composed himself. How many of the men are refusing to do their duty? The governor looked at him with something like wonder. Why, all of them, Lord. I would not trouble you otherwise. It was an impossible situation. Viecki could not help imagining what his Magister Yarike would think when he failed at even this less glorious task after complaining about Naji being given the work around the great gates. But short of killing enough valuable workers to frighten the rest into compliance, what could he do? The caverns known as the Forbidden Deeps cut right across the path of the new canal, and it seemed impossible to dig around them swiftly enough to make a refuge ready before the Northmen broke down the gates. Nor was Viecki such a fool as to completely discount the men's fears. He knew they had good reasons to dislike the deepest places. Even after the Hikedaya had held Nakiga for close to 50 great years, 3 long millennia, as mortals would reckon it, the mountain still held many secrets. The Order of Song knew some of them, which was part of what gave them such power in the Queen's city, but the mountain had hidden depths that even Akinabe, and perhaps even Queen Utuku herself, might hesitate to plumb. Viecki had felt the terror of those deep places himself in his early years, the freezing claw that gripped the heart and turned all one's thoughts into leaves swept up in a howling gale. He had even once seen Yarike himself turn back from a place that he said was too dark to enter, though the High Magister had held a brightly burning torch. How to force mere laborers? He could see no other choice. Go back and keep the men quiet, Troop Governor Ruhol. Occupy them with some of the finishing work in the tunnels that are already completed. I will devise a solution. And spread no more tales, nor let others spread them. Go back? For an instant, the governor, who had come prepared to be executed for his failure, did not look overwhelmingly grateful that he was being sent back. But he quickly smoothed his expression into blankness. Yes, my lord, you are very wise. I will do just as you say. Though he could hear the sounds of hammers striking stone in many other parts of the city, Viecki thought the Street of 8 Ships, usually bustling with workers and their overseers, was strangely quiet today. It made the constant shuddering boom of the mortal's mighty ram even more dreadful. The builder's order house was all but empty, and the functionary outside the High Magister's sanctum told him that Yarike was out somewhere, supervising one of the many sites where the builders were laboring to protect the city. Viecki was frustrated, but since the functionary could not, or would not, tell him precisely where Yarike was, Viecki had already turned to leave when he met High Foreman Naji in the doorway. Naji, always correctly courteous, made the appropriate gesture of greeting to an approximate equal, reminding Viecki that whatever he might have been promised, at this point he was only one among several host foremen that Yarike commanded. Is the old man in a good mood? Naji asked. He is not here. Viecki was suddenly curious. Is he not at your site at the gates? He has scarcely been there, not for days. Perhaps we have earned his confidence, and so he chooses to spend his time elsewhere. Naji was an unemotional type, generally uninterested in things he had not already learned, but he was no fool, as his look of deliberately bland inquiry demonstrated. Why do you seek him? The last thing Viecki wished to do was talk about his unruly workers. It would have been hard enough to admit it to the High Magister. Nothing. A trifle. How goes your work on the gate? Naji made a gesture of sufficiency. It still stands, but the great bolts are slowly shaking free of the surrounding stone, of course. With all the weight above it, if the gate is not flush, that will put great strain on the lintel. For a moment he seemed ready to talk about their shared profession, but a sudden look of distrust flashed across his face, and his posture became more rigid. But are you not in charge of the refuge down in the deeps? What brings you back up to the city? As I said, a trifle. Just an idea I wish to discuss with the High Magister. Viecki wanted to end this conversation. If word of his troubles with his workers filtered back up to the city, the other high foremen would see his visit to the order house for what it truly was, desperation. If you see our master, tell him I will find him another time. Naji looked mollified, and his posture became less formal. As I said, I scarcely see him. He is here, then he is there, as swift and hard to track as a rumor. He communicates with us mostly by messenger. The High Magister complains about his years, but should I ever reach such an age, I pray I have even a fraction of his vigor. Age does not always weaken its victims, Vieki thought. Sometimes, as with Lord Akinabi, it made them more cruel, more dangerous, and more powerful. These are deadly times, was what he said to Naji. Our master gives his all. We can do no less. Vieki felt the hypocrisy of his words even as he uttered them, and abruptly changed the subject. And what of the fighting outside the mountain? What do you hear from the order of sacrifice? Naji shook his head. Grim things, I fear. The Marshal and General Sunoku must conserve their forces in case we fail and the gate is breached. So the numbers of those fighting the Northmen are small, yet more of them fall every day, though we can ill afford to lose even one sacrifice. But Sunoku inspires them to keep fighting, and the gates have held for far longer than most thought they would. What do you think of her? Of the general? For the first time, Naji's mask of formality slipped entirely. I think she is the greatest of us, saving only the mother of all, of course. We are blessed by the garden to have her in this dark time. Such courage! But even more, it is a courage that she can lend to others when their own has fled. She is brave, yes, and fierce. I saw her at Tangleroot Castle and at Three Ravens Tower. There were moments when Vieki remembered the bright-haired warrior as he had first seen her there, and he could almost believe that she could save them all. But they were only moments. I must go now. I dare not leave my governors in charge too long. I know what you mean, said Naji. The unsaddled goat quickly begins to bite. And then he did a strange thing, extending his arm and hand for the other to clasp. May we both bring credit on our order in this evil time, Host Foreman Vieki. Who knows when we will see each other again? And Vieki, who had spoken truthfully but spitefully about Naji's shortcomings many times of late, was shamed. He put out his own hand and clasped Naji's arm just below the elbow. Yes, Order Brother. May we both make our master proud. And if we do not see each other again in this world, we will meet in the garden. They parted, Naji to his other business, Vieki back to the depths, and his workmen who would not work. And if the High Magister's wisdom was not available to him, he knew he must solve the problem himself. He owed it to his queen and his people. As he walked down the front steps of the order house, the iron ram crashed against the outside of the gates once more, shaking all that was not solid bedrock. Even the bells of the temple towers swayed from the shock and uttered softly, like the moans of frightened children. Isgrimner never slept well in the field. Part of it was the absence of Gutrin, of course, of his wife's familiar, soothing shape in the bed next to him, of her voice that calmed him in the night and reminded him that there was more to life than his worries. On this night, he had been slipping in and out of thin sleep for hours, and also in and out of a dream in which Izorn, his eldest son, his dead son, rushed at a gate that broke and gave way. Behind it lay the darkness of an endless pit. As Izorn struggled at the edge of this terrible fall, his father tried to call to him, but could not make any kind of warning cry. Then, as his dream self flailed, speechless and helpless, something hit the side of his Grimner's tent with a loud enough noise to send him tumbling out of the dream and onto the floor. He shouted for his housecarls as he scrabbled in the darkness for his sword. Hadi! Kar! To me! Again, something struck the tent, this time scratching and clawing so that the wall bulged first in one place, then another. Some heavy shape was trying to rip its way in. A bear, perhaps, or worse, a troop of murderous, white-skinned Norns. To me! he shouted. "Where are you all?" At last he found Kvalnir. His fingers closed on the sword's hilt, and in a moment he had worked it out of the scabbard. "Duke Grimner!" Hadi was just outside the tent. He sounded like a terrified child. There are!" Grimner kicked off the blanket, still tangling his legs, and staggered upright, then pushed his way out of the tent flap. He had only a moment to stare at Hadi, a trained killer who looked like a terrified child. Then the bustling, thumping noise started again behind him, but this time the tent yawed and then collapsed beneath the assault. Grimner could see only the dim outlines of something struggling in the midst of the poles and bunched hides. What in the holy name of the Adon is happening?" the Duke bellowed. Hadi, bizarrely, had fallen to his knees on the snowy ground and was now praying. All around, other shapes moved between the tents of the Duke's commanders, some running, others limping or even crawling. Grimner could make no sense of what had happened, only that it must be some terrible disaster. Had the earth shaken? Had a great tree fallen? A muted noise of something being torn dragged his attention back to his fallen tent, where a dark shape rose from the wreckage. For a brief moment, the Duke thought he had been right in his first guess, that it was a bear or some other large animal. The thing was crouched and hard to make out, except for a gleam of broken teeth. Then it struggled upright, and he could see it full in the starlight. It was man-shaped, draped in rags, dusted with snow, and tattered until they were let me start that one again. It was man-shaped, draped in rags, dusted with snow, and tattered until they were little more than cobwebs. But the eyes, above the grinning jaws, were empty black holes. Duke Grimner had only a moment to gape at this incomprehensible apparition before it lurched toward him, muddy hand grabbing at the empty air. The Duke lifted Kvalnir and moved crabways, keeping the great blade between him and the dismal thing. The night was full of despairing cries, but when Grimner called, he heard no answering shouts, and he felt a moment of utter terror, thinking all his men might have been attacked and killed in their sleep. The thing with no eyes stumbled toward him like a drunkard, head wagging, jaws snapping loosely. Only as Grimner drew back his sword to ward it off did he see and recognize the bracelet on the thing's clawing hand. It was gold that Grimner himself had given out as war booty after the battle for the Hayhold, a reward to his brave soldiers. This dead thing had been one of his own men. The creature moved as crookedly as a wagon with a broken wheel, but showed little fear of his sword, so instead of poking at it, Grimner strode forward, swinging Kvalnir in a broad arc to take the thing high in the neck. He felt the blow land, felt the bones beneath the rags snap. Then the thing staggered to one side and toppled. "Hadi! To me! Curse you!" Grimner called, but before he could find Hadi or any of his other liegemen, the thing the Duke had just killed dragged itself back onto its feet. "Damnation!" was all Grimner could say. With its neck cut mostly through, the dead man's head hung limply to one side, bobbing and swinging as it staggered toward him. The Duke cursed again and kept cursing as he lifted his sword and shoved it into the thing's guts, or at least where its guts should be, then put all his weight into it so he could drive the living corpse back into the wreckage of his tent. Even tangled in the tent's hides, the eyeless thing still did not stop trying to get up, but by luck the Duke had sliced through its backbone with his last thrust. Now the struggling figure looked like two men huddled in a single costume for some holiday merriment, neither half able to get the other to cooperate. Grimner swore again and hacked with broad Kvalnir until the head finally came off and the dead thing stopped moving. Hadi had vanished, and none of Grimner's other servants were close by. The camp was in chaos, and now that his eyes had adjusted to the dark, The Duke was unsettled to see how many of the shadowy shapes around him were not his living soldiers, but corpses animated by witchcraft. He began shouting again for his men, but before any of them reached him, he had to kill 2 more of the terrible things, including one that had only 1 leg, but still hopped slowly after him with intent to murder. Using Kvalnir more like an axe than a sword, he managed to take off the heads of both revenants, while sustaining only a few scratches, but already he was winded and seeing sparks at the edge of his vision. Terror was stealing his breath, making him feel as though he fought uphill at a fierce angle. Some terrible Norn magics were at work, that seemed certain. How many of these creatures were there? How many have we buried? He thought bleakly. That's the answer. Some of the Duke's living men finally found him, their eyes bulging with horror as they begged him for answers he could not give. He took a moment to look up to the slope above the camp where they had buried most of the dead, a spot that received more sun than most, which had made the frozen ground easier to dig. A swarm of clumsy shapes were clambering from the burial trenches there, slipping and tumbling, but always moving downhill toward the living. "Take their heads off," he told his men. "Without a head they fall and stay down. Take their heads!" He was relieved to see a bulky shape he felt sure was Brindur, gathering men of his own, and beyond that, like a single tree still standing after a great windstorm, Vigri's banner had been raised, and someone was waving it in the air, drawing more survivors. As Duke Grimnir's own small troop set about cutting down the dead that surrounded them, he saw others doing the same. The rout was halted, the men recovering, and the tide of battle finally seemed to be turning, or at least he hoped so. But many of the Rimmersmen had realized what they fought, and were weeping, even as they cut and hacked at the clumsy dead things. "More cursed Norn tricks," Grimnir thought, "and this one the foulest of all. Still, they could not hope to defeat our greater numbers with such slow-moving foes, even if they are our dead comrades." Something tugged at his thought, something beyond the moment's struggle. But wait! What followed the last time they created such a horror? The white foxes always have more than one purpose. His mind suddenly clear as Grimnir began to bellow, "Ware the gate! Men, ware the mountain! All eyes, watch for the white foxes!" Other voices picked up the Duke's call and added their own, lifting their warnings above the shouts and curses of those fighting the dead. As his Grimnir hacked the head from a stumbling thing that would have pulled down one of his soldiers from behind, a sentry's horn sounded raggedly from the base of the mountain near the gates. He heard some of his men shouting, "The gate!" and "The mountain!" and "The gates are open!" Another screamed, "The white skins are coming!" His Grimnir cursed himself for being right, and also for not being right swiftly enough. "That is the real danger," he bellowed. "Men, close up! Fight your way toward the Nakiga gate! We are attacked! The Norns are trying to flee the mountain!" But that did not make sense, he realized, even as he shouted it. Where would the Norns flee to? The mountain was surely their last refuge. Still, it was clear now, from the eddying shapes moonlight made of the battling men, that those nearest the gate, the sentries and the engineers tending the siege weapons, were bearing the main brunt of a wave of attackers. "It's the ram, damn it!" the Duke cried out as he finally understood. "Hurry to the ram! Vigri! Brindur! They mean to destroy the ram!" His men could replace the great tree that was its body, he knew, but if the Norns managed to ruin or make off with the mighty iron head of the bear, it could not be replaced before winter came. There was not enough iron left in the camp to forge another without leaving the army weaponless. "Leave the dead where they are and cut your way toward the gates," he shouted. It was like a dream, like his dream, like falling helplessly into darkness. "By all that is holy, does no one hear me? Protect the ram!" Porto would never forget that night, the night the dead woke up. He and the rest of Erling Surefoot's men had found a new tunnel on the mountain, killed its single guard after an exchange of arrows, then blocked the passage at the end of the cavern with heavy stones and logs. With so much to do, they had not returned from the mountainside until after dark. It had been a fearful task, clambering down those icy, treacherous slopes when they did not dare light a torch for fear of lurking Norn bowmen. So by the time they reached the bottom, the mountain goats had collapsed into sleep in a great huddle, without bothering to find their way back to their designated fires. Porto woke at the first shouts, but in his weariness he took the cries for something less fearful. Men brawling among themselves, perhaps, a common thing during this long, bone-chilling siege. It was only when he heard the great creaking noise of the Nakiga gates swinging open and the nearest sentries shouting their alarms that Porto realized something dire was happening. Mounted shadows swept outward from the gate, cutting down all before them in an unnatural near silence. Even the cries of their victims were louder than the muffled hooves of the attackers' mounts. Then, as Porto hurried forward, trying to find one of the scattered groups of soldiers to join, he saw that the Duke's camp was being attacked not just from the front, but from the rear as well, creating terrible confusion. A man-shaped figure came staggering toward him out of the dark. At first he thought it was some hideously wounded Northman, which in a way it was, although this one's wounds had killed him days or weeks earlier. The thing barely had eyes, just gleaming wetness deep in the sockets, and its rotting shroud exposed gaping, bloodless wounds in its face and chest. The dead, he realized, terrified but also strangely unsurprised. The Norns have raised the dead. Our dead. He dodged the thing's clumsy reach, but was almost caught by a swipe from the rusting knife clutched in its other hand. The thing did not even seem to realize it was armed, swinging both arms aimlessly, and Porto thanked God and all the saints that the things were slow as he leaped past it and brought his sword around hard enough to slice the dead man's neck to the bone. The corpse stumbled, then slowly turned toward him as if its head were not half severed. Porto dragged his sword free and this time hacked at the corpse's legs until he smashed its shin into a ragged white pulp of bone and unbleeding flesh, and the thing finally toppled. Meanwhile, he could hear the cries of his fellows as the shadowy white foxes from the gate darted in and out among the Northmen, dealing death and terrible wounds, seemingly at will. Porto finally severed the corpse's head from its shoulders, stilling its movements, but he had been driven away from the nearest group of his fellow soldiers, and now stood by himself in a swirling chaos of men and shadows. Some of the dark shapes seemed impossibly swift, others slow as dying insects. He called out for Erling and the rest of the mountain goats, but he might as well have been shouting in an empty forest. Something careened toward him, a huge dark shape that, only at the last instant, he saw was a horse and rider. He had only time to throw himself flat on the snowy ground before he felt the wind of the rider's stroke pass just above him. When he rolled over, the Norn had vanished into the dark again. Porto did not know how long he had been fighting, or even whether many of his fellows still lived. His greatest fear, though, had not come to pass. He had destroyed 6 walking corpses and crippled several others, but none of the dead faces had been injuries. He hoped that if the demon's spell had roused the dead boy, the stones piled on his grave had kept him in the ground. As he stood for a moment, head bowed, fighting for breath, he heard a shout of something like triumph. It didn't sound like the poisonous cry of one of the Norns, but like that of a good, hoarse, mortal man, and he felt a sudden hope. What had happened? The greatest knot of fighting was down by the gates, where Porto could see a large number of living men surrounding a single pale rider who was slashing away on all sides with a blade that was invisible in the darkness, but clearly swift and deadly. Then one of the mortal spearmen got in a lucky thrust, and knocked off the rider's helmet. The Norn's horse reared, and Porto saw a gleam of moon-pale hair. It was the female Norn warrior he had seen at Tangleroot Castle, he felt certain, the woman who had brought reinforcements to save her kin trapped in the ruins. Half a dozen Northmen's bodies lay beneath her horse's hooves, but she was fighting defensively, and even as he admired her speed and skill, Porto ran toward the fight to help his fellows. Thane Brindur and a few of his men were still trying to bring her down with hand axes, swords, and jabbing spears, but the Norn woman made her horse spin so swiftly it seemed like magic, and each time her arm swung, a man reeled back with a fountaining wound or collapsed where he stood. Somebody called from the gate. This time it was no mortal voice, but a high, bird-like screech, and the Norn woman immediately wheeled her mount toward the sound, her sword cutting the air so swiftly that the soldiers she had been keeping at bay could only throw themselves on the ground and then crawl away to avoid being trampled or decapitated. The pale-haired warrior galloped back toward the gate and the shadows waiting for her there. The Northmen got to their feet and chased her, shouting in triumph. "We've driven them back," Porto realized. He had never really thought he would survive this storm of death and madness, but the Norn horde was retreating into the open gate, fleeing back into the mountain. Brindur led the chase, but he was on foot, and the Norns moved like wind itself, seeming to glide across the uneven ground. The Northmen could not catch them. Porto slumped to his knees. The massive Sally gate groaned as it began to swing inward, then slammed thunderously shut behind the last of the Norns. A dozen or so Northmen leaped and shouted and pounded on the gates with their weapons, still seized by battle madness, as if they could conquer the entire mountain by themselves, if only they might pass the threshold. Porto could feel all his new wounds, the sharp cuts the shadowy Norns had dealt him, and the scrapes and bloody wheals left by dead fingernails. He was so tired that he almost lay down among his dead and wounded comrades to sleep, but feared he would be buried by mistake. As he stood, trying to get his breath back, his legs shaky as a newborn colt's, he saw something crawling toward him. It was so low to the ground he wanted to believe it was some scavenging animal that had crept out onto the field in search of human flesh, but it did not move like any natural thing. He lifted his sword. The blade felt heavy as a chestnut wood beam. His terror that the dead thing would prove to be Endry or some other comrade ended when the crawling shape lifted its face to the starlight. He did not recognize its agonized mouth or staring eyes, but there was something strange about it that still caught his attention. He stood all but unmoving as the thing kept crawling toward his feet, his blade quivering with the effort of his aching arms to keep it upright. The slick wetness of the blood trail left on the snowy earth behind it caught his eye. As it drew near, it raised a wavering hand toward him. Then, when the effort was apparently too much, it let its pale hand drop onto Porto's boot.